My HOA thought I was just another homeowner they could bully. They tried to seize my farmhouse. The meeting ended very differently when they learned who actually owned the mortgage to their entire neighborhood. The day they came for my home, they thought I was powerless. They thought I would fold, but they had no idea who they were really dealing with. I still remember the sound of the knock like it happened yesterday. It wasn't friendly, it wasn't casual. It was sharp, confident, and cold, the kind of knock that tells you bad news is standing on the other side of the door. When I opened it, two representatives from the HOA stood there, dressed neatly, holding a thick folder of papers clutched tightly in their hands, like weapons they were ready to use. They didn't ask how I was doing. They didn't comment on the weather or the land. They went straight to business. According to them, my farmhouse violated community standards. They spoke in rehearsed sentences, as if they had practiced this moment many times before. The fence around my land was non-compliant. The paint on the house was outdated. The way I used my own land didn't align with their future vision for the neighborhood. I listened quietly as they flipped through their papers, pointing at photographs and printed rules. Every sentence felt colder than the last. Then one of them looked me straight in the eye and said the words that made my stomach drop. If I didn't comply with their demands, they would begin the process to seize my farmhouse. In that moment, the world felt strangely silent. I could hear the wind moving through the trees behind me, just like it had when I was a child. But inside my chest, everything tightened. That house wasn't just another property on a map. It wasn't an investment or a line in a rule book. That farmhouse was my grandfather's land. He bought it with money he earned from years of hard labor, waking up before sunrise and coming home with dirt under his nails. I grew up running through those fields, chasing fireflies in the evening and helping fix broken fences on hot afternoons. That land taught me responsibility. It taught me patience. It taught me what honest work looks like. Every wall inside that house held memories. The kitchen table where my family shared meals. The porch where my grandfather would sit quietly, watching the sunset, reminding me that some things in life are worth protecting no matter the cost. And now, two strangers were standing there telling me it could all be taken away because my fence didn't match their aesthetic. As they spoke, I noticed something else. They weren't angry. They weren't emotional. They were calm. Too calm. They spoke like people who believed the outcome was already decided, like people who had power and knew it. To them, this wasn't personal. It was procedural. But to me, it felt like someone reaching into my chest and squeezing my heart. The idea that a group of people I barely knew could erase generations of history with a signature on a paper made my hands shake. Still, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just listened. One of them handed me a formal notice and explained the deadlines in a flat tone, as if he were reading instructions for assembling furniture. When they turned to leave, they didn't say goodbye. They simply walked away, already convinced they had won. I stood there on my porch long after they disappeared down the road, staring at the fields that had shaped my entire life. The same fields they saw as a problem, as an obstacle. That's when I realized something important. They weren't just enforcing rules, they were testing limits. They spoke like they already owned everything, including me. Like my history, my memories, and my home were nothing more than inconveniences standing in the way of their control, but what they didn't understand was that I don't walk away from what my family built, and I don't surrender quietly. The HOA pushed too far. Over the next few weeks, the letters kept coming. At first, it was just one envelope slipped into my mailbox, then another, and another. Each one carried the same cold tone, formal, emotionless, and final. Fines, warnings, deadlines. The words were printed neatly, but the message behind them was loud and cruel. Comply, or lose everything. Every time I held one of those envelopes, it felt heavier than the last, Not because of the paper inside, but because of what it represented: pressure, threats, power being used without compassion. The neighborhood started to change too. Neighbors who once waved from across the road now looked away when they saw me. Some crossed the street to avoid conversation. Others slowed their cars, watching quietly as if my situation were a warning sign posted for everyone else. A few brave souls whispered apologies when no one else was around. They told me they disagreed with what the HOA was doing, but were too afraid to speak up. "We don't want trouble," they said. I could hear the fear in their voices, fear that if they supported me, they would be next. That's when I realized the HOA had already won something far more dangerous than fines. They had won silence. Still, I believed reason might reach them. I told myself that if I showed them the truth, they would understand. So I did everything the right way. I attended HOA meetings, sitting in stiff chairs under bright lights while board members shuffled papers and avoided my eyes. When it was my turn to speak, I explained the history of the farmhouse, how it existed long before the neighborhood, how it was passed down through generations, how it was never meant to be erased by modern design rules. I spoke calmly, respectfully. I even brought old photographs and documents, hoping they would see what the land truly meant. They didn't. I offered compromises. I said I would repair parts of the fence. I offered to repaint sections of the house while preserving its original character. I asked for time, for understanding. They rejected everything. One board member leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and smirked. With a voice dripping in confidence, he said, "Rules are rules. No one is above them." The room went quiet. That was the moment it finally clicked. This wasn't about rules, it wasn't about paint, fences, or land use. It was about control. They didn't want solutions. They wanted obedience. They wanted to prove that their authority was absolute, and that anyone who challenged it would be crushed. Not long after that meeting, the final notice arrived. The HOA had scheduled a vote to begin foreclosure proceedings on my farmhouse. A date was printed clearly at the bottom of the page like a countdown clock ticking away everything my family had built. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat alone in my farmhouse, the lights dim, the air heavy with memories. I ran my hands along the old wooden walls, feeling every groove and imperfection carved by time. These walls had stood through storms, droughts, and decades of change. And now, they were being threatened by signatures and meetings held behind closed doors. I walked from room to room, remembering laughter, conversations, and quiet moments that no rulebook could ever understand. I wondered how power could be so cold, how it could erase decades of memories with such ease. For a moment, I let myself feel the weight of it all. But beneath the fear, something else was growing. Clarity. They thought my silence meant weakness. They believed I was overwhelmed, cornered, and running out of options. They mistook patience for surrender. What they didn't know was that I had stayed quiet on purpose. While they were sending letters and holding votes, I was watching, listening, preparing. Every threat they made, every rule they twisted, only strengthened my resolve. They were pushing harder and harder, convinced they were in control, and they had no idea how close they were to pushing too far. They learned the truth. The final HOA meeting was nothing like the ones before it. The room was packed wall to wall. Neighbors filled every seat, some standing along the back, others pressed against the walls. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation and quiet fear. Everyone knew what this meeting was about. Everyone knew a decision was about to be made that couldn't be undone. At the front of the room, the HOA board sat behind a long table, arranged neatly like judges. They looked confident, comfortable, almost bored. To them, this was just another item on the agenda, another problem they were about to eliminate. I took a seat near the back and waited. When the meeting officially started, they went through routine matters first, dragging out the moment like it didn't matter. Budgets, maintenance, updates, minor complaints. all while glancing occasionally in my direction as if enjoying the suspense. Finally, the chairperson cleared his throat and announced the last item on the agenda, the vote to seize my property. The room fell silent. He spoke in a rehearsed tone, explaining how I had failed to meet compliance deadlines and how the HOA was now forced to move forward with foreclosure proceedings. The words sounded official, polished and final, like a verdict already. Decided. That's when I stood up. I didn't rush. I didn't raise my voice. I stood calmly, steadily, and waited until every eye in the room turned toward me. You could hear the faint hum of the lights overhead. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I introduced myself again, even though everyone knew exactly who I was by now. Then I said something simple, something quiet, something that changed the entire room. I believe, I said, you should review who currently holds the mortgage for this entire neighborhood. At first, no one reacted. Then confusion began to ripple through the crowd. Board members exchanged looks. A few people frowned. Someone in the audience whispered, "What does that mean?" Phones came out. Papers were shuffled nervously. One board member flipped through his binder as if the answer might magically appear on the page. The confidence at the front of the room began to crack. I continued speaking calmly, as if I were explaining a basic fact instead of pulling the foundation out from under them. I explained that years earlier, long before the HOA ever knocked on my door, I had made a quiet investment through a private firm. At the time, it seemed like just smart business. Nothing more. That investment turned into ownership. Ownership of the mortgage bank that financed the entire development, every single home in the neighborhood, every commercial office, every shared facility, including the building the HOA itself operated. The silence that followed was absolute. No whispers, no movement, just shock. Faces went pale. One board member slowly lowered his pen onto the table, his hand visibly shaking. Another stared straight ahead, blinking as if he were trying to wake up from a bad dream. The chairperson opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again. For the first time since this ordeal began, he had nothing prepared to say. I watched as realization spread across the room. Not panic, yet, but disbelief. The kind that settles in when people realize the power dynamic they relied on never actually belonged to them. Then it happened. The same board member who had smirked at me weeks earlier, the one who said, "Rules, our rules," finally looked up. Our eyes met. He couldn't hold my gaze. He looked down at the table, suddenly fascinated by the grain of the wood, his confidence completely gone. The man who once spoke like an untouchable authority now looked small, exposed. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't even accuse them of wrongdoing. I just let the truth sit there. Heavy. Unavoidable. They had tried to seize my home using power they believed was absolute, and in that moment, they learned something they never expected. They weren't in control. They never were. Power redefined. The vote was canceled. Just like that, everything changed. No dramatic announcement. No public apology. No explanation offered to the neighborhood. The board quietly moved on to the next item on their agenda, pretending the last few months had never happened. The fines disappeared from my record. The legal threats vanished. The seizure attempt was withdrawn as if it had been a clerical error instead of a calculated act. They didn't admit they were wrong. They didn't have to. Their silence said everything. I could have ended it there. I could have walked out of that room, satisfied that I had won. Part of me wanted to. After weeks of pressure, fear, and humiliation, retaliation would have been easy. I had the leverage. I had the power. I could have used it the same way they tried to use theirs. But standing there watching the board avoid my eyes, I realized something important. Winning wasn't enough. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to become the very thing that had threatened my home. Power used only to punish doesn't heal anything. It just changes who's holding the weapon. So I made one request, not a threat, not a demand, a condition. I asked that the HOA formally recognize and protect legacy properties, homes and lands that existed long before the neighborhood was developed. Places with history, places with meaning. I asked that they treat homeowners with respect, not fear. And most importantly, I asked that they never again abuse authority to silence or intimidate people who simply wanted to protect what was theirs. The room stayed quiet, then one by one they agreed, instantly. No arguments, no debates, no smug smiles this time. They nodded, signed the documents, and accepted the terms without hesitation. In that moment, I saw it clearly. Their authority had only ever existed because no one had challenged it before. Now it had limits. Life slowly returned to normal after that meeting. Neighbors who once avoided me began to wave again. Some stopped to talk. A few even apologized for staying silent. I didn't blame them. Fear has a way of shrinking people's voices. What mattered was that the fear was gone. Today, my farmhouse still stands, strong, untouched. The fence is the same. The paint is the same. The land remains exactly as my grandfather left it. In the mornings, I walk across the fields as the sun rises, the grass wet with dew, the air calm and familiar. The same land that once felt threatened now feels peaceful again. But I don't walk it with anger in my heart. I walk it with clarity, because this experience taught me something that no rulebook or board meeting ever could. Real power isn't loud. It doesn't need to intimidate or dominate. It doesn't hide behind paperwork or threats. Real power is quiet. It's knowing when to stand firm without raising your voice. It's knowing when to protect what matters without destroying others in the process. And sometimes it's knowing when to show mercy, not because the other side deserves it, but because you do. The HOA tried to take my home. They thought authority was on their side. They thought rules made them untouchable. They thought silence meant surrender. Instead, they learned a lesson they'll never forget. Power doesn't come from control. It comes from restraint. And some things, like history, dignity, and home, are worth standing up for, no matter how powerful the opposition seems. If this story moved you or reminded you of something worth protecting, take a second to like this video. And if you enjoy real stories about power, justice, and standing your ground, subscribe to the channel because there are many more stories like this coming.